Hey class, so as you're working through the content for Unit 2, Activity 3, I was reading through and just seeing what assignments you had going on, and was really thinking about how the material applied to my own life. So when I look at what you were reading through, one of the things that stood out to me was the transition to adulthood and really what that means. And so for me, when I look at when I was 19, I headed off to university, and I was there for 4 years and took a year off to work, and then went to teachers college and started my career when I was 23, 24, and I was married that year as well, and then, you know, moving forward have been in the same career. And I was really looking at, you know, what ages I moved into that. I started having kids when I was 30. I probably would have liked to have had them earlier. But looking at when we see the transition to adulthood, or what we're defining as adulthood, what does it look like today, and how has that and why has that been changing over time? So I just thought I'd go through, as I was reading through the material, I started to create questions, as a social scientist does. And so for that reason, I was focusing on this talk, and interestingly enough, the question that I created to start investigating about the transition to adulthood, to connect it to my own life, actually brought me full circle to this speaker here, Jeffrey Jensen Arnott, who's quoted in the article that I had found based on the question that I had been investigating. So, just looking for where I had the article. So I found this article, A Longer Road to Adulthood, and it was just done by a Google search. I was looking for Canadian content, and I was looking for something that would connect to specifically delayed adulthood, and I think I typed in education, adulthood, later transition. And so when I found this article, the real question that I was asking, and I just sort of put it over here, I copy and pasted it into a Google Doc, and I'm just going to show you how I annotate and then make comments on the articles that I read, how I'm thinking through the reading that I'm actually doing. So the first thing that I had was a question: is the need for post-secondary education changing the traditional milestones of adulthood? And I came up with that question because I was really investigating, you know, when we look at what is adulthood, is education actually delaying that? Because we have a credentialism-based society where you have to have, you know, credentials behind your name in order to get good jobs, and jobs that pay well and have benefits. And so I stumbled upon this article in my research, and I'm really looking for answers as to, is it just education, or is there so much more? And so as I read through here, one of the interesting things that I found was it identified, and it didn't really state who it was coming from, but in Canada we identify 5 major milestones as you are an adult if you're reaching these milestones, which is finishing school, leaving home, becoming financially independent, marrying, and having a child. And so when I look at those, if I was to say when I reached them, I was in my early 30s by the time I had the last milestone of having a child. And all of those were delayed for a number of reasons. Then traditionally, my mother would have had me at a younger age. She was married when she was in her early 20s. You know, so all of these things in terms of questioning, if we're pushing back when these things are actually happening, and this is what we're saying makes us an adult, then what's pushing them back? Is it our own personal choices? Is it society changing? What is it? And so the author of this particular article is identifying that he himself is reaching these milestones much later than his parents and even grandparents reach these same milestones. So there's a delay happening, and the big question is what's causing it. So looking at some of the concepts, it was identifying modern jobs need modern training, and so education is a big part of this. So looking at women in particular, in terms of rejecting traditional roles within the household and saying that education was more important and getting a good job for themselves was more important. So in a large portion of society, that education is more important than getting married. And I can honestly say that there was a few students that I knew that were in their undergraduate and were engaged or getting married, and for me that felt so foreign, like I wasn't there, even though I was 21 years old, that felt like a giant step in a direction that I wasn't quite headed into yet. So people are prioritizing education because they understand that fundamentally that education is going to lead them to what they feel is a better life, or that they're going to be more able to find jobs that will lead them down the traditional milestones that they would like to have. Are you able to have a family, to buy a home, to have the freedom and independence of adulthood if you don't have job security? And that's one of the big questions, because that kind of brings it full circle again. In 2011, the census found that 42.3% of 20 to 29-year-olds were living at home, and the big question was why, and is that higher? And the answer is yes, it's higher, and some of the reasons that they can speculate are that that they were never leaving, because if they don't go to education, if they don't go to post-secondary education, then they're typically finding a job that's close to home. So they're still living with their parents until they can financially make that next step. And if they're returning to live in the home, often crippling student debt, not finding a job that pays them enough to live independently, all of these are reasons why they come back. So we're finding that first step of leaving home is actually delayed, because 20 to 29-year-olds more frequently than previous generations are still living at home. So they're not taking that first step in that stage. So when is it happening, and why is it happening? There's so many reasons that revolve around education as to why that could be occurring. So as I scrolled down, I found some other things. Looking at, this is where Jeffrey Jensen Arnett comes in. He wrote a book called Emerging Adulthood, and it's referenced here in the article, that maybe we need to redefine what adulthood is. That maybe, in fact, it's less about marriage and having kids and starting your family, and maybe it's more about having independence, accepting responsibility for your own life, and looking towards some of those milestones, but ensuring that you have the responsibility in place before you actually engage in those milestones. So when we're looking at the idea of reaching adulthood, and there were so many theories that were connected to this in terms of what stages you hit or what age you're hitting them at, and when you move from being a teenager into adulthood. And I think there's really some fundamental issues that as social scientists we need to investigate, that if we see a trend like people not starting these major milestones that traditionally were the markers of adulthood, then why are they hitting them later? And does that mean that a 20 to 29-year-old living at home is not an adult? So in terms of looking at adulthood, we're looking at delayed transitions, as well as redefining what is adulthood and whether or not the previous generations, their definition of it actually matches up with us in modern society. So that's just some thinking through. I'm going to post the drop boxes for all the assignments that you have due this week. And please email me or send me questions if you would like to talk through some ideas, whatever it may be, but just make sure you get those done. And if I don't talk to you before then, have a great Easter weekend.